We're living in an increasingly diverse country, and history shows that diversity often introduces challenges that are difficult to overcome, ranging from increased social tensions all the way up to violence. But it has long been argued that diversity is our strength, and that with meaningful contact between heterogeneous groups of people, we can break down barriers and learn from each other. One of the responses to increased racial and cultural diversification is to embrace multiculturalism, where we can both acknowledge and respect differences that are inevitable in a complex society. Jesse Singal, a journalist with New York Magazine, takes that point of view. Others have argued that what we need to do is emphasize assimilation, and perhaps even be more selective in the way we do immigration in order to ensure social comedy and cohesion. Andy No, a journalist and editor at Quillette, takes that point of view. On this episode, we'll discuss how we should address issues like increased cultural diversification in America and greater Muslim immigration to the European Union. Welcome to Extremely Offline.
Interestingly enough, actually, we have been talking to Jesse for a long time about doing an episode, and we wanted to focus on Jesse's coverage of trans issues, I guess is how I would put it. There might be a better way of phrasing that. But Jesse, you're like the most infamous guy on Twitter because nobody will go on with you, at least to discuss that issue. That's been a real challenge, more than perhaps any other guest, which is something we could also get into talking about why that's the case. But Andy was also somebody we've been interested in having on for a long time, and we thought you two would be could have a great conversation because I think you both have experienced I think you share some perspectives on the excesses of the culture wars, but probably little else that you agree on, which always makes for a good episode. We got some common ground and quite a bit of difference.
Andy, it'd be great to start with you. So how did you get into writing about these topics? You write about very sort of interesting topics that I think are in one. You cover a lot of niche subcultures, a lot of stuff that happens online, but also see what happens when that online stuff goes into the streets and offline. So how did you get involved in this kind of work?
Living in Portland, Oregon, and sort of being at the epicenter of a social justice culture, I was just wondering if the public was aware of some of the excesses. I mean, a lot of the coverage in the past couple of years have been focused on things happening on university campuses, but I was hoping to shine a light on what happens when that type of ideology and worldview is mainstreamed into outside of the campus, into an entire city, into the politics of the city, and then you have instances of in this particular case where I live, Antifa and similarly allied movements being able to riot and take over streets with impunity.
And in doing that kind of work, what kind of response have you received, sort of from readers, from the U.S., elsewhere, people from across the political spectrum?
Well, I'll start with the reaction I get here in Portland. I'm generally treated as persona non grata. I was a graduate student at Portland State when I first started writing about this stuff, and I could see how I was disliked there. But now that my profile has grown, doors are just shut in my face all the time whenever I try to reach out to interview people to get their side of the story. So there's a lot of misinformation out there about me. Activists, particularly with like Rose City Antifa, they will accuse me of being a racist or supportive of white supremacist causes. And, you only need to whisper those words and nobody wants to get near you.
Well, it's interesting the phrase that you use, persona non grata. And as we had mentioned earlier, Jesse, we had worked so hard to get somebody on this show to talk to you about some of the trans issues that you've written about, kind of detailed long-form reporting you did for New York Magazine and also for The Atlantic. And I think that a number of the people we had talked to maybe had treated you sort of in the same category. So, Jesse, why don't you talk to us about the issues you think that made you controversial? And maybe you can offer your own opinion about maybe why people don't want to come on and talk to you about those particular issues.
Yeah, I mean, I always want to be careful when I talk about this because off Twitter, I'm not controversial. And, basically what it comes down to is I wrote a couple articles. One was about the a clinic in Toronto was shut down, a gender identity clinic, and I found that the process used to shut it down was sort of riddled with errors. And this doctor, Kenneth Zucker, who was not well liked among a subset of the trans community, the hospital sort of took rumors and innuendo about him and took a claim that I proved was false and used that as an excuse to shut down the clinic. And I think to some people, I was accused of defending him, and he'd been accused of conversion therapy. So that's, defending the indefensible. And then the other article, I had a cover story in the Atlantic last summer that was about 13,000 words long, where I just sort of, dug into the controversies of what the diagnostic process should look like for, kids who want to go on puberty blockers and teenagers who want to go on hormones. It's a live debate within psychiatry and psychology and trans healthcare. And I quoted some of the top clinicians in the country talking about how this is difficult work that needs to be done carefully. And yeah, there was a pretty big online backlash to that article. My operating theory is the reason, I don't think there's actually that much disagreement between myself and the people on Twitter who are mad at me. I mean, it could be that they, maybe they don't think there should be a diagnostic process for a 14-year-old before going on hormones, which can have permanent effects. And it could be they think that I'm sort of focusing too much on the possibility of regret and on these stories of so-called detransitioners who transition and transition back. But yeah, I don't know. I've obviously reread the story a lot. It doesn't stake out anything approaching an actual controversial position relative to the U.S. I think there's subsets of Twitter where it's just an issue you can't really talk about in a at all, comprehensive way.
Jesse, to what extent, when you get into these fights on Twitter, or oftentimes they're one-sided, they're just people attacking you, but to what proportion of those discussions are about actual things that you've written versus, like, are most of the criticisms you get like, you took this one position on this issue which I disagree with, or has it become so you just have a personal brand that's been defined by others and they're attacking that brand, not anything that you've actually written or anything that was in that Atlantic piece?
Yeah, it's much more the latter on Twitter. I mean, I've basically stopped trying to engage on Twitter, but when I've had these sort of surreal instances where I'll, for 15 minutes just try to get someone to explain to me what they disagree with me about, and then they'll make a claim about something I've said that I never said or said the opposite in my article. I think via email and sometimes Facebook, I get some more measured, accurate criticism because in articles of the length and complexity of these two that made me controversial in some quarters, there's obviously going to be stuff I could have done better, stuff I could have done differently. But it's been sort of an object lesson in how Twitter is just a very, I don't know. It's not a good place to discuss anything complicated, and it really has been like 80% just genuinely bad faith. People not misrepresenting my position. At this point, I have corrections to prove it in a lot of major outlets, including the New Republic today. People just keep writing stuff that doesn't line up with anything I've said, which is, as a writer, frustrating. But on the other hand, what are you going to do about it?
Andy, how is it that you've kind of processed criticism when you get it for things that you write? Would you say that some people are kind of making that criticism in good faith and you critically consider it, whereas others aren't? Or like, what would the ratio be? And how do you process? How do you sift through the kind of both criticism and invective that you get in terms of your writing?
I would say that my experience of criticisms has been a bit different from Jesse's in that I feel like a lot of the vitriol that Jesse gets is really vicious because it's people who are lashing out at someone who they view as part of their side, and they recognize that his writing is influential and powerful because he tells real stories and he cites quotes from medical experts and so on and so forth. A lot of my critics will dismiss me more outright and attack me, I think, just on a personal partisan basis, because I write about issues and that are in the culture wars, for example, and I provide political commentary at times. And so I more rarely get good faith criticism. Sometimes I have, and what I need to get better at is being able to process those type of critiques that are meant to improve my writing and point out things that are weak in what I say or argue. I think because I've received a lot of personal attacks, I've become a little bit reactionary at times in that, like, I feel like any criticism immediately is one that is in bad faith, which they're not always. So that's an area I have to work on.
Can I ask you, Andy? So I've read a lot of your coverage of the stuff going on in Portland and the actions that you've written about and that I've seen reported elsewhere as well about Antifa and affiliated groups taking on the Patriot Prayer groups at their protests. There's plenty of excesses to point to. There's plenty of ridiculous, both invective and acts of physical violence to point to. And I've seen less from you, and I may have just missed it, but in terms of critiquing the Patriot Prayer folks and the sort of the whatever you want to call them. Some people call them alt-right. That might be unfair. I don't know. But the other side of the issue, because it seems to me like, these are folks who are holding up this free speech banner, and their free speech rights should be protected. Absolutely. But I don't actually believe that that's the motivation behind the actions that they're undertaking. I mean, it seems to me like these groups instigating these protests in Portland, and I do think it's groups on the right that are going into a very liberal city and instigating these protests, which is which is in no way defending the reaction that they elicit, but it just seems like it's like real life trolling. It's like, the same thing that folks do online. I would say both the left and the right engage in this online, just saying outrageous things in order to get a response. And they're doing it in real life, and it has physical consequences, including violence. Am I being unfair to the Patriot Prayer side by characterizing it that way?
I think some of what you just said is fair and accurate. I would not describe them as an alt-right movement. In the past, when they were doing public rallies, they did attract some random people who espouse extremist views, but the organizer since then has done a good job at vetting people and making sure that there are not extremists attending his rallies. I do get the criticism a lot that I don't speak out enough about the radicalism coming from these right-wing movements in Portland. I guess with my writing, I have chosen to focus on one particular side because the rest of the media here as well as nationally already provides negative coverage to Patriot Prayer and the Hymn 2 movement and the small group of people involved in right-wing activism here. And I don't think that there's anything else that I can add to it. A lot of what they have to say is moralizing, and it's misinformation, accusing them of just being racist. And so for me, my goal has been more about let's shine a light on what's happening on the other side that people are not willing to speak about in the local media or in the national press.
Well, it's interesting. I think in terms of both what you write about and what Jesse writes about, we are kind of confronting the issues that happen when you exist in a diverse, kind of heterogeneous society, right? We're not all the same. We don't all have the same political beliefs. We don't all have the same sexual orientation or gender orientation. And these kind of problems pop up, and I think that that's kind of the root of a lot of the issues both of you write about. And Jesse, I kind of wanted to ask you about this, in that, I think, and we have actually recorded recently another episode about the role in Islam in the West, which is another issue about diversity and multiculturalism. But in terms of the larger kind of gamut of multiculturalism, U.S. demographics are shifting in a particular way to where whites will be maybe a minority in my lifetime. To where we'll see rapid immigration from Asia become one of the largest sort of immigrant groups in the United States. In Europe, we're seeing large influx of immigrants. Many of them are from Muslim-majority countries, from North Africa and the Middle East. How where Jesse, where do you see kind of the right and the left kind of making mistakes in terms of how this multiculturalism needs to happen, how integration should be happening, and where do you kind of see like the promising side of it? Where do you think are the benefits of having this greater diversity, and as well as the challenges?
I think the most obvious mistake the right makes is just the right doesn't have enough faith in America is a melting pot in a lot of ways, and people within a generation or two really do come to feel like Americans. Like even when you survey recent immigrants, they feel a strong connection to America. Immigration has always been part of our identity. So I think a lot of right-wing panics, originally about Latino immigration, which still exists, but more recently about Muslim immigration. I don't know. This is one of the few things we do well that in many ways we do better than the EU. And usually I'd be happy to bash America and say the EU does a lot of other stuff better. But I think conservatives just don't have enough faith in what we've got going on. That doesn't mean we treat immigrants perfectly or that there aren't, areas we can improve. But it just seems like they endlessly recite the same scary stories about people coming here and not integrating. And on the left, I do think on the left we sometimes... I don't think it's racist to acknowledge that. Like if there's a big influx of people from a different place with different cultural values, that's going to create some tension at first. And diversity itself can sometimes cause tension. And there's, the social psychology is complicated here. Like the contact hypothesis is the basic idea that if you get different people together, they'll get along and grow to like each other. But it sort of depends on a lot of stuff. It depends on them having meaningful interactions. It depends on them not always being like a white guy goes to a bodega and his only interactions with an Arab is the guy clerking there at 2 a.m. Like, I think this stuff is complicated. And I do think, the left sometimes makes it out like you can just sort of mix different people together and it'll be a kumbaya situation when it does sometimes take more work than that. And I don't think people who acknowledge that it takes work and who want to make that system work better should be shouted down as racist.
Well, Andy, this is interesting in that, 3 out of 4 people on this episode are people from minority ethnic backgrounds. Our parents or recent ancestors emigrated here. And I believe your parents came here from South Vietnam after the end of the war. In many ways, you are an integration success story. But I think that you do have some skepticism about how multiculturalism and integration is happening right now, if I'm right.
I do. This is another issue that I write about. One of the things I do write about a lot is migration and culture and identity, and that's probably where I get the harshest criticisms because it attacks one of the sacred cows of the liberal left, which is this utopian belief of multiculturalism. I think what we are seeing in Western Europe can be a warning to the United States for what could happen here if we repeat the same mistakes that political leaders in Western Europe have. And I am more familiar with migration patterns in Western Europe and some of the challenges that are happening there in society and the consequences that it's having on the body politic across the continent as well. You brought up my family's background story. My parents came to the United States as refugees. And I think perhaps if I was 10 years younger, I might not have been a assimilation success story because fortunately when I completed my undergraduate and all that, this was before the explosion of the grievance ideology that we're seeing now, and now we're seeing in mainstream American politics as well. I think what I find concerning with people younger than me, people who are finishing universities now, is that they are being brainwashed into a worldview of hating the societies that their families have emigrated to, and hating not just the dark history, parts of the dark history of this country, but hating actually what this country stands for. And I recognize that maybe because of where I live, things are a particular political bubble, and it may be different on the aggregate. But I'm just, what I find concerning is among other people of color, people who are really privileged, particularly if you look at how so much of the world lives in misery, either under political oppression or poverty, and all the opportunities that are given here, my mind is blown that instead of gratitude, what they have is hatred.
But I guess I'm skeptical of all of that. I mean, so we have some of the same sort of radical people who hate both of us. I have no doubt that there's some people who hate America, or who are, so drowning in their own grievances that they can no longer integrate. But this is a pretty limited phenomenon. And I feel like if you're going to make a claim that within 10 years, things have gotten so much worse politically that recent immigrants are no longer assimilating correctly, there should be some data to support that, some polling. And I just don't see that at all. Do you think there's a risk that because you hear so loudly from a small but very vociferous subset that you're over extrapolating? Because what you're describing would be a catastrophic sort of crack up of our basic assimilation infrastructure. And I feel like we'd see other evidence of that.
I think that criticism is fair, but what I point to is that you just look at the new face of the Democratic Party, which is a very recent phenomenon, and the ideas that they represent is part of this grievance worldview, and now it's found mainstream footing in the Democratic Party, and it's no longer confined to just university critical studies type of courses, but is actually part of the mainstream politics. And so that's why I set the time frame for something relatively recent.
Sure, but what would be an example of something, someone who could actually get the Democratic nomination has said that you find, so beyond the pale that we should be worried about it?
I don't know if there's an actual single type of thing. It's more of a pattern of things that they say. I'm thinking of, the three that come to mind right away are Ilhan Omar, AOC, and Rashida Tlaib. They're not running for president, but even though they're just representatives in Congress, they have been able to command significant attention in our society as well as in the politics.
Andy, earlier on you made reference to sort of I think you said the utopianism of multiculturalism, and this is where I somewhat differ. So I grew up in Berkeley, California, which is obviously famous for being, at least in the past, not so much now, but being this kind of melting pot culture. And back then, there were, a lot of white kids listening to hip hop. There were a lot of Mexican kids who loved the Smiths, and that's still the case. But I think more and more, like where I would agree with you is that there's a discourse on the left around things like cultural appropriation, which reject that kind of that kind of fluency across cultures, in which that those critiques are actually, I think, a rejection of multiculturalism. Those critiques stand against multiculturalism, not in favor of them, because they are ultimately about separating out cultures and preventing those cross currents from happening. I have a critique of that because I do believe in multiculturalism, but I think from my own upbringing, I've seen it as a real practical reality. I mean, this is not to say that things were perfect back then when I was growing up, but it was a lot. Some of the dynamics that are at work right now, it's gotten worse. It's like they weren't there before. There was certainly racism, there was segregation, but there was also a lot of cross-pollination. There was a lot of, just simple enjoyment of life in a diverse community without this kind of factionalism and sectarianism that exists today. So I see it as like a far from utopian, as something that is a very practical. In fact, I don't really see an alternative for a multiracial society but to be multicultural. And that's what's kind of given me pause about a lot of the discourses on the left, and that's left me thinking of myself as, well, I'm not going to identify myself as this, but has left me more sympathetic with sort of the liberal as opposed to leftist value system, which seems to be the only political sect still left that's embracing the idea of a melting pot community.
Well, I mean, there's one thing I want to push on with you, Jesse, is that so there's a poll. Pew Forum polls
all kinds of things. But they also polled like Muslims in America recently, and there was a finding there that I found very fascinating, which was they asked Muslims about discrimination of various types, and what they found is that for every single type that they asked, immigrants reported a lot less discrimination than U.S.-born Muslims did. So, for instance, 65% of immigrants said there's a lot of discrimination against Muslims in the United States. 91% of U.S.-born Muslims said the same. 20% of immigrant Muslims said someone is acting suspicious around them. 47% of U.S.-born Muslims said the same thing. Just having grown up with this background, I find this to be an incredibly strange polling result, because U.S.-born Muslims tend to be much better integrated. They tend to be viewed kind of as much more assimilated. They don't have any accent problems. They don't have any kind of issues with understanding the language. To me, this self-reported data does suggest that there is a shift, as Andy has discussed, in terms of viewing discrimination against yourself, perhaps exaggerating it even in your mind or perceiving it differently than some of the older generations did. It does seem to show up in this data. I find it fascinating, although obviously we don't have a detailed explanation as to why.
Yeah, I think the reason first of all, I would agree with you that I'm sure the more integrated and progressive people are, the more likely they are to think, racism is a big force in society and to talk about it in sort of a woke and progressive way. But I guess the reason I'm not entirely impressed by the statistic is I think a lot of recently arrived Muslim immigrants probably go to heavily immigrant communities. I mean, you think of places like there's neighborhoods in New York City or Dearborn and stuff like that. So they're probably I would imagine they're just not as exposed as much and not integrated as much. And there's other, I don't know, I was looking at the same poll, actually, the Pew Forum poll of Muslims in America. And there's other items where younger Muslims do seem more liberal than older ones. So I just, I get what you're saying. I think there could be other explanations for that.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk a little bit, Andy. So you had mentioned Western Europe. I think one article you had gotten a fair bit of criticism about was an article where you actually went to somewhere in England and you went to sort of a heavily Muslim British area. You walked around. I think you visited with a mosque. And you wrote about it, I think, somewhat skeptically in terms of the population there. Can you talk a little bit about how you produced that article and sort of the feedback you got, and if it made you change your mind about anything?
Sure. In Britain, they've been having these discussions about Islam and integration for much longer than Americans have. And in my travels to the UK, I've never gone to any of those particular communities that are so-called parallel societies. And so I wanted to go and see for myself, as an outsider to that community, to go and to see if what it really looks like outside of the polemical coverage that it gets often in the right-wing press or the denials in the mainstream liberal press. And so when I visited, I went to several areas throughout London, and what I noticed right away was the dress of the people, and I spent a bit of my writing focusing on that. And I don't think that it's insignificant. These are primarily communities of people with immigrant backgrounds from Pakistan or Bangladesh or India, and yet a lot of them were dressed in Salafi Arab clothing, which suggests to me a certain particular strain of Islam that has been mainstreamed in those communities, that it's not actually, that Islam is not predominant from where these people are actually originally from, but it's taken root in British Islam. And so you see lots and lots of niqabs, which are the face coverings, abayas as well. You will see very, very young girls covered in various forms of hijab, which is not even a mainstream Islamic practice. I went into several Islamic institutions and Islamic centers to see what type of literature they were disseminating. A lot of it was in a different language. What was in English, I gathered. And the ideology that was that I found in the literature was concerning in that it was radical. And when I say radical, I don't mean that it in terms of like supporting terrorism, anything like that. It's more of expressing a fundamentalist interpretation of Islam, of what practices you must do if you are Muslim. And so I wrote about this experience, and I never use terms like no-go zone. You know, that's a very inflammatory term that's also a misnomer. I describe them as parallel societies, which are communities that operate autonomously in some ways. And this is one of my criticisms of multiculturalism, particularly when it's instituted at a political level, is that the state will encourage separatism in communities by building up these separate institutions that represented by religious community leaders who then so everything is kind of like it is able to function within a community itself, and you don't have to have interactions with the rest of mainstream society. Probably one of the most surprising areas I went to was Leighton, which is where Tommy Robinson is from, and he's that controversial anti-Islam activist in the UK. And in Leighton, you see what separatism looks like and its impact on minorities within those communities. And by minorities, I'm referring to people who may be ex-Muslims or converts to another religion, or gay, or and impact not necessarily just to minorities, but also women as well. There was a certain ethos of modesty that was expected in businesses around modesty culture in terms of segregated fitness centers, clothing, so on and so forth. So I recognize the shortcoming of my piece for the Wall Street Journal. That one was strictly anecdotes. And that was where I received a lot of criticism, because when you're just pulling out random anecdotes, people may have different experiences as well. So they would point that out and say, why didn't you include that? I ended up writing a longer follow-up that was more reference data, more survey data that was written for the Spectator. So I hope answers your question.
Yeah. I mean, Andy, I thought my frustration with the Wall Street Journal article was it felt like you wandered around these neighborhoods that were not familiar to you. And I know you did talk to some people, but it seemed like you went in, almost with the goal of being scared or of scaring readers. And some of the examples you used of like a sign saying this is a no public drinking area, which is just a normal sign you see in a lot of places. Or you mentioned Muslims headed to mosque and non-Muslims not making eye contact. But London is not, a city known for friendliness or eye contact. And I think part of the reason I was frustrated with the article is I've seen you do other good reporting. Like, I actually think people should read your stuff on these really weird, questionable seeming hate crimes in Portland, where there are all these people reporting hate crimes, but like the police just aren't hearing about it. In a lot of cases, like, it's genuinely suspicious, and I'm glad someone is stepping up and reporting on something that controversial. But like, last summer I did an apartment swap in a neighborhood in Berlin called Neukölln, and it's exactly the kind of neighborhood you were writing about. And it's just very different when you live there, even if for a little while, and when you're a little bit, I wasn't friends with the people there. I didn't even fully speak German, let alone a lot of them spoke Turkish or Arabic. But a lot of people really are scared of Muslims, and I think we've seen the results of that. Like in our foreign policy and what happened during the Bush years, that doesn't mean that any criticism of Islam or of conservative gender mores in Islam is Islamophobic, but I just think you need to be careful with a story like that. And I've wandered around these kinds of neighborhoods, and they tend to have really good food. Like, I've lived there. It's just not. I felt like it was superficial and maybe a missed opportunity. Like, there are important questions to be asked about integration and how to make sure it happens. And especially in places like Paris, like this is a real issue where there's this whole sort of underclass of Muslim youth who feel completely cut off from society. And in the long run, that's going to be a disaster. And in the long run, it's probably a matter of both better government policy and trying to talk to people in those communities and see what's happening. But I think a more nuanced, sophisticated treatment of the subject would be better. And I just felt like that article sort of stoked fears unnecessarily.
Well, to address one of the criticisms you brought up about my inclusion of mentioning a no alcohol sign in Tower Hamlets, that's a mea culpa. That was corrected within a day of publication, but that was my fault. That was included, even though what I wrote was not inaccurate, but I did not provide context around it that would inform readers about that these signs are normal. And I didn't know that, so this was my fault and my mistake. And I own up to it, and I apologize for that publicly. As for the other critiques, I think particularly with a lot of cosmopolitan white liberals who their interactions with these areas are they might briefly live in one, near one, go through it briefly, and it's just familiar of these areas with their good food and cool music and different dress. It's like exotic, right? But if you talk to people who are dissidents, who are from those communities and live in, you can really see the impacts of what it's like. From my Spectator piece, I interviewed a gay ex-Muslim man who grew up in one of these areas and what it was like to sort of be completely isolated from the rest of society and not really having anyone know or care, and not being able to find any type of support. I spoke with, as well as a ex-Muslim young woman who, as a girl, faced abuse in her family and community, and because they were so segregated off and had their own separate institutions and representatives, for example, she says that when she reported the abuse to police, the South Asian police officer at the police station who happened to be from that same community her family's from actually took her to a family member where she was further punished. And these are stories that you can hear over and over when you talk to people who have escaped. And so that's like this darker side of multicultural policies that you don't see when you're just passing through in a car or taking a bus and going there for the good food, and you leave, and you're not actually living in what the consequences of an ethos informed by fundamentalist interpretations of Islam.
Sure, but if you had written a piece for the Wall Street Journal saying we should support gay Muslims, I would have shared the piece and celebrated it. And if you'd written a piece saying young Muslim women who want to dress in some places, who want to dress in a certain way, are punished for it severely, I would have done the same thing. I would have celebrated it. But I think the problem was, and whatever, it's one article. You do other good work that I've enjoyed, but the problem was it was just much broader than that. And I think when you use language like, making this about multiculturalism itself, or you say multiculturalism has failed, I would want like a more nuanced account of what do you mean when you say sort of multiculturalist policies are making it harder for gay Muslims. And yeah, it just demands, I think, more care than that, because I don't disagree with you that I do think there's a thing with white liberals acting like serious forms of homophobia and misogyny in other parts of the world can't be talked about because sometimes they're intertwined with Islam. I think that is a problem, and I would agree with you on that, but I think you should just write about that issue itself rather than I just think it's easy to get seduced by this whole multiculturalism has failed thing, and I think it's really complicated, and we're also, the peak of it is over, but this was a period of historic migration into the EU from Syria and Afghanistan and places like that. So it's been a particularly tumultuous time, and I frankly don't see evidence for the idea that multiculturalism has failed. I think that humanity is a challenging endeavor, and there's some stuff that needs to be improved.
We hope you're enjoying Extremely Offline. Right now, we're paying for the show mostly out of our own pockets. We'd like that to change. If you can spare just a few dollars a month, please visit patreon.com/extremely-offline and chip in just $3 a month to help us keep this show going. Thank you so much. Andy, can I ask you what is your policy prescription sort of that's appended to your critique of multiculturalism? You know, I would imagine that a piece of it would be immigration restrictionism, which we could talk about, we could debate, but we already live in a multicultural society. It's here, and you know, in the U.S. we're talking about U.S. citizens. We're not talking about just people on some sort of temporary residency. So, given that that's the case, what policy prescriptions would you draw out of your critique?
I think immigration has to be slowed. If you look at voting in Western Europe, that's an issue that voters care about. And because the establishment parties have been unable to stem the flow, as well as ignoring these concerns in the public, people are going to parties that were formerly more fringe. We also have to talk about identity, and this is a difficult topic because it intersects with issues around race in the United States and in other parts around the world. We're witnessing what happens when, let's say, white identity is radicalized into violent extremism. I recommend the work of the political scientist Eric Kaufman, who's at the University of London, who's written a book called White Shift. And it's important to, I think, have discussions about what space is there for a white majority to have an identity. Because right now, I in the mainstream discourses, we are told that this is something that's not allowed, given the history of the oppression caused by whites and white supremacy, that any type of identity rooted based on your ethnicity, if you happen to be white, is condemned outright. And when other identities and cultures are celebrated, as they are in multiculturalism, and the majority identity is suppressed and shamed and treated as only a legacy of violence, it pushes people to look into places where their grievances can be affirmed. And in my writings about alt-right activism, and there is a small movement in Portland, surprisingly, and this is just anecdotes, but continually, one after the other, when I'm talking to these young people, asking, why are you drawn into these white nationalist beliefs and all that? It's primarily a reaction to the excesses of the social justice left in their...
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to tease out, actually, because I'm wondering if your critique is principally just a discursive one, critiquing the discourse of the progressive left and the way, the discourse around identity, and the way in which it forms white identitarianism. Because, I mean, as far as that goes, I have, I would agree with a lot of that critique. But if it goes beyond a discursive critique, it's like the alt-right folks themselves are responding to their critique of multiculturalism leads to the embrace of ethno-nationalism. They're like, we can't all live in one society. The melting pot idea is this utopian fantasy. We're inherently tribal. That's who we are as human beings. It's part of our human nature. We all need to live separate from ourselves in our own ethnic tribes, our own ethno states. that's extremist fascist rhetoric, and I don't think anybody. I would hope that nobody that none of the four of us would want to have anything to do with that. So is your critique, would you say, pretty much strictly on the discourse level, on the way that people are talking about identity, as opposed to the way in which people are living together in a multiracial, multicultural society?
Well, first, I think we need to have a clear definition of what multiculturalism is. The way you've been using it, and many people do, is they use it as a synonym for a multi-ethnic society or pluralism, which it's not. Multiculturalism as an instituted process involves basically encouraging separatism among communities and keeping identities distinct and separate and protected. You can look, Britain is probably one of the strongest examples of what it looks like to institute those policies. You can also look at Sweden, for example, where if you want to establish a organization that represents a particular community, you can apply for funding, and a lot of actually extremist religious groups have exploited that to use state public money to fund Islamist causes. So, if we want to talk about pluralism, let's use that word. I think multiculturalism is something different.
I guess just on the whole question of sort of white culture, to me, one of the big mistakes a lot of people on the left make is lumping all white people together and say, this sort of discourse we have going now, white people need to do better, white women elected Trump, blah, blah, blah. I think in much the same way that there's a strain of discourse that overestimates the extent to which all black people feel like they're part of the same community. And that's even more true when it comes to Latino people and Asian people, which can be carved into a million different groups. Everything from ethnicity to income. The whole idea of unified racial groups that all have the same thoughts and same agenda has always been a little bit of a myth. And I think that's even more so with white people in the U.S. because we're the biggest group. And I can't imagine I know that there's a subset of conservative and far-right people who do think that they have some sort of white identity, but in the U.S. people celebrate their Scottish pride, their British pride, their Italian pride, and so on. I guess I just have trouble even understanding what it would mean to celebrate, well, for lack of a better term, white pride.
Well, I have to interject here in that it's interesting because I grew up in the Deep South. This is Zaid talking. I grew up in the Deep South, obviously in the late 80s and 90s. I didn't grow up in the 50s and 60s, but when I think about, I think if you talk about white pride, okay, we're thinking about like white citizens councils and groups that tried to stop integration, and that's obviously one association. Of course, that association doesn't necessarily mean everybody, and I haven't read White Shift. I'd like to read it. It sounds pretty interesting. The guy's written some pretty interesting New York Times articles, the author. But I think the issue is, and maybe it doesn't even apply to the four of us, because while the three of us are from ethnic minority groups, Jesse is Jewish, so you also kind of have a thing.
Shalom.
Shalom, exactly. But I think that for a lot of white people in the U.S. society, they don't think of themselves as Scottish or British or Irish or English or whatever because they're mutts, right? They're too intermarried. It's been too many generations. So they kind of don't have that racial identity to attach to. And we know that when groups become smaller in number, and whites may be a minority at some point, that they may actually attach themselves just to that white identity, even in a non-reactionary, like non-sectarian way, meaning they're not setting up a white citizens council to like kick people out of their schools, but they're saying, hey, everyone around me is very strongly attached to this racial identity. I should be attached to mine too. And I'm wondering if that is something that actually you will see. I mean, it's kind of a tacky example, but like if you're American living overseas, a lot of times on July 4th, they'll all get together and act like Americans because they're such a small minority in some of these countries, and they'll, have a cookout or whatever. They don't say they're white. Almost all of them are white. But that's kind of like, it's not necessarily a supremacist expression of identity. It's just like, hey, we are a super minority here, but we do want to celebrate like our culture. So I can kind of see the white shift kind of thesis playing out. There's obviously a huge caveat and tripwire there that in the recent past, or I say recent, but 40, 50, 60 years ago, when whiteness was identified as a distinct group, it was identified specifically to segregate that group from other people and also to often be supreme to those other groups. So I understand why the reaction is there. On the other hand, as demographics in the U.S. change, if people are going to be highly attached to their racial groups, I could see a non-regressive, sort of non-supremacist variation of having some type of white identity or pride, the same way people at one point had Irish pride or Scottish pride, and some people still do. I think, Jesse, where you live in New York City or in Boston, you see that. But I think for a large portion of the atomized white population in the U.S. that's so big, a lot of people don't necessarily have anything to attach themselves to. I think a lot of white people just think they don't have a right racial identity. I'm just the norm, right? But they won't be the norm at some point, which I think is where the challenge of the multiculturalism comes in.
Yeah, I just pulled up, there's an article in the Times called White Identity Politics Aren't Going Anywhere. This is from a political scientist who said that the percentage of white, between 2012 and 2016, between 28 and 42% of white people said their identity is very or extremely important to them. Their identity as white people. And they're actually, surprisingly, there wasn't that strong a correlation between white identity and animus toward other racial groups. So this suggests, first of all, so it's about a third of white people who feel, a fairly strong sense of white identity, which, that's a third of what's already, 50, I forget the percentages. But the point is most white people do not feel a strong sense of whiteness. But as you're saying, as we become the minority, and I do mostly identify as white because I don't really deal with any anti-Semitism day to day. I agree. It's important to figure out what that's going to do to their sense of whiteness. And I think in many cases it could fuel, white nationalism and white supremacy.
Yeah, it seems like there's this quandary because, there's a critique out there, which I agree with, which is that, white people, since whiteness is identified as neutral, as the baseline, and everybody else is defined against being white, it's an unfair situation. It's one in which, you're considered normal if you're white and you're somehow abnormal if you're non-white. That's problematic in a democratic society. On the other hand, every historical example we have of an alternative to that seems to me to be white supremacist. I mean, I shouldn't go that far because I don't think it's racist to be proud of your Irish ancestry or your German ancestry or whatever. But to be proud of your white identity, it's just I can't. Maybe it's a failure of my imagination. I just can't imagine that in any way other than a reactionary, racist, fascist formation, because there hasn't been one in the United States to date. There hasn't been this sort of friendly alternative to a friendly white pride movement. But it seems like that's the alternative to white people being the baseline and having effectively no identity, which is perceived, and I think understandably so, as racist by those who are non-white.
Well, Andy, I want to ask you because I've seen you interviewed in other contexts about your Vietnamese heritage. Because one alternative to this is that people move away from racial or ethnic identifiers altogether, and they start saying, "Well, I'm an American," or "I'm, I do improv comedy. That's my identity," or "I like to play baseball."
That's
right?
my race is improv comedian.
Right, exactly. Which I do improv comedy. So I honestly think of myself more as that than I ever think of myself as Pakistani. Because I grew up in the United States, and I'm a little tan, but. Anyway, Andy, I want to get your take on this because I know you've had some interesting thoughts on your own identity.
Yeah, I was interviewed 2 years ago by the OPB, Oregon Public Broadcasting, on the series of race in the Pacific Northwest. And pretty much all the other people they interviewed, they talked about how they identified very strongly with the ethnic minority and that they felt like living in a white majority place like the Pacific Northwest was isolating and difficult for them. For me, when I was younger, I had a much stronger Asian identity. I used to say stuff like I was proud to be Asian, whatever that meant. Now that I'm older, I look back and I just think I don't see why, to me, I don't see why you should be proud of being part of a particular race. I think what I say is that I am proud of the culture that is part of my family history. And I think that's an important distinction. being part of a race is just something you're born with and a label that other people give to you, but cultural traditions that are handed down and passed down, that's something you can actively take a role in. So I'm now much more, I will say more carefully that I am proud of the heritage and traditions that I have inherited. So I apply this sort of critique of race pride to ethnic minority groups as well. I know, like, primarily you'll see that type of criticism directed to white pride, but I feel the same way instinctively when I hear people who say they're just proud to be brown or proud to be black. I think, like, I would hope that what they're trying to say more is what they're proud of the cultural and heritage that they descend from, and that they're able to actively take a part in. So
now, Andy, you do. I believe I was reading that you are gay, right?
I am.
So to me, part of me feels sympathetic to what you're saying, and I very rarely talk about being proud of my race or my ethnicity. I engage in cultural functions, I do religious practice, but I don't talk about the pride that much. But I do think in certain contexts, if you're in an environment where everyone is harassing you or bullying you or putting you down for a certain thing, you may develop pride in response. And I think one example where basically nobody finds it controversial now is gay pride. These events are in response to being marginalized or bullied or just told you're not normal, et cetera, et cetera. Would you find that to be a positive expression of identity?
I've struggled with this a lot. I came out kind of late, and then for a number of years after that, I never even attended a Pride. I think the first time I went, I liked the festive mood, but at the same time, it seemed to be not a celebration of gay activists in the past who came before us and sacrificed so much, in some of them in their lives even. Like, it wasn't a celebration of that, it was basically a celebration of debauchery, being able to engage in sexual conduct openly in the streets. And to me, I didn't see how that was honoring the legacy of gay activism. And that's my criticism of most gay prides in the United States. I think they serve a very different function in other countries and societies where homosexuality and other forms of other identities of sexual minorities are taboo or outlawed, and yet the activists there muster up the strength and bravery to make themselves visible. And I find that more of a dignified way. I think in the US now, at least with homosexuality and bisexuality, it's no longer controversial, and so I would like to see gay communities leaders think of how to evolve what the purpose of a Pride festival parade is.
I think when people say that they are proud to be black, proud to be Asian, proud to be gay, I think the statement politically is really, I am not ashamed to be X, Y, or Z. And I think that is I think that's a reaction to, living in a society in which currently, or at least at some point in history, there was an expectation that you should be ashamed to be those things. And so I think that there's a valor to making that statement. And this is where, this equivalence that some people on the right will draw about, like, well, why can't we say we're proud to be white? Well, I think it's pretty obvious, and I think it's even probably obvious to those people that there's a completely different valence to saying you're proud to be white, because you're not living in a society in which there's any sense of shame for being white. And I don't think there should be any shame in being white. I don't think there should be any shame in being any of these things. But the statement is, being that it is not a reaction to some sort of normative expectation that that's something to be ashamed of, it has a completely different connotation. So that's where I would say I hear what you're saying about like what is the point of being proud to be something that you had no control over and that you were born into. But I think it's not so much an affirmative statement about being proud to have an identity that was inherent to you, but rather it is a rejection of the expectation that you should feel some sort of stigma attached to it.
I feel ashamed to be Jewish, but I'm comfortable with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Leighton, what you said, that's probably the most healthy expression of it. And that's why I thought about the gay pride example as something I think has often played a positive role in history, although I think other times people are taking the sort of pride act or taking the example into chauvinism, where it becomes their persona or their brand, and they're using it as a tool of power or as a tool of social power rather than as something defensive. I mean, I could say that among Muslims. So, for instance, like Andy had mentioned earlier, he saw women with their head covering, niqabis, hijabis, in Britain. I think for a large part of the Muslim community, liberals within the Muslim community often wanted to get away from kind of requiring women to wear hijabs, from being covered. But I think that in Europe, when they ban people from doing that, let's say in public service jobs, it creates a reaction where people think, okay, well, I don't want to make my entire persona or my identity this thing. I don't want to shove it in people's faces, et cetera, but now I feel like I have to react in solidarity. I should be wearing the hijab because, the president or his prime minister is talking crap about Muslims, so I need to present more in that direction. And to me, that kind of gets to, if somebody, if we are seeing these expressions of pride and we do feel like some of them are becoming chauvinistic or reactionary or sectarian, we should think about where they're coming from. And I think maybe in terms of some of what Andy's seen in terms of people who are joining kind of very fringe far-right groups, maybe some of them do feel like in the subcultures and the culture they're in, they are being attacked for being white, so they end up kind of going off the deep end and saying, well, I need to be super chauvinistic and in your face about this. But Jesse, I wanted you to weigh in on this. I mean, as the token white guy on our episode, what is it that you've seen in terms of, particularly online tribalism? I think you've seen a lot of people. You followed a lot of stories about people who've gone off the deep end, I guess, is the nicest way I can put it, and that you've seen so many of these online controversies pop up. You've seen how people have reacted to them. Is this something that you're seeing? You're seeing kind of reactive forces pull on each other in terms of discrimination and pride and anger and trolling?
Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry. I mean, my basic theory of the case is that social media completely destroys people's brains, and the more time they spend on it, the more their brains get destroyed. So I think it has a terrible impact on everything we're talking about, wherever you are on the political spectrum, whatever your identity is. It really it reinforces whatever your dumbest opinions are, your most radical opinions. It reinforces them because you will get routed to people who are similarly dumb and radical. And it sort of, yeah. I always I don't want to be a technophobe, but I watch the way even sort of professional editors and journalists, and I think you guys can probably identify with this, because you're watching the same people I'm watching. They say sort of crazy stuff online, and it's just not a good environment.
Yeah, and I mean, is that the sort of, how do you? Okay, so in their book, so Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff wrote a book about college campuses, but I think it applies to much larger than the college environment. They talk about a polarization cycle, and in that cycle, basically, it starts with someone says something provocative, controversial, maybe really stupid. The other side kind of picks on that, makes it the worst thing in the world. Everyone's got to denounce it, talk about it, try to get the person fired. The original person or cohort or group starts to think that now we're under attack, so we got to keep doing what we're doing. So it's like a vicious cycle, right? And I just have a really hard time seeing how level-headed people break those cycles. And you've reported on so many of these blow-ups. One of the areas where you reported on is these young adult fiction novel blow-ups, where somebody's writing a novel, there's something in it that leaks, there's a detail that leaks, and people interpret it a certain way, they exaggerate it, the author comes under attack, they say, okay, I'm just going to cancel the book. Could you talk a little bit about that and sort of how that cycle operates and how maybe you would advise breaking that cycle?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so the short version, and there's a really good piece by Kat Rosenfield in this in Vulture from 2007. Basically, there are these people who are very online, and they sort of find things to be mad about in young adult fiction books, usually without reading them, just from the publicity materials or from rumors. And they've managed to get a couple books unpublished. Although just today, one of the unpublished authors announced she's actually going to publish her book after all. So basically, people just get really, really mad about books they haven't read, where they don't know the full context. My favorite example is like a lot of young adult books about race feature a racist character getting less racist. So people take out of context an instance of the racist character doing a racist thing and get outraged by it, which is like, I mean, it's sort of crazy because the whole point is the character is getting less racist. But in terms of how to improve it, I just think people should be educated about the way that social media strips context and helps people spread false rumors and stuff like that. I also think like what this author did, Emily Zhao, she's basically ignoring the online haters. And I think for most people in most communities, you can ignore dumb people on Twitter and angry people on Twitter. That isn't always a luxury people have. Like, you know, if you're in journalism, a lot of them are your colleagues and you might not always be able to ignore them. But I think the more they can sort of be ignored, the better, even if that's not always realistic.
I think the identity stuff, though, to be fair, I think it precedes social media. I think social media has made everything in the world worse. But, you know, the first spike in what's pejoratively called political correctness took place in the 90s, prior to social media. I've spoken to Adolph Reed before, and he has a theory about it. I don't know if I don't know enough about the history to be able to vouch for it or not, but he talks about how, there used to be this progressive left on college campuses, which was very much attached to the materialist union-based left outside of college campuses. And with the demise of the labor movement, that relationship was severed. And since there was no sort of institutional attachment to a broader left that was not based on college campuses, these campus activism turned inward, and it turned into, setting up these different departments for Chicano studies and for African American studies, et cetera, instead of towards civil rights and things that were based in the broader world. And that sort of gave rise, that structuration encouraged this kind of identity-based politics that came out of college campuses. Again, this is I'm probably not doing his history of this justice. I don't know much about that history, but it is to say that, this stuff existed before social media came and made everything worse.
Yeah, the other, everyone should read Age of Fracture by Daniel Rogers. It just shows how there's been just this confluence of events in American life with sort of civic institutions breaking down. Like you mentioned labor, but also, people are less likely to be part of a church or other civic institutions. And I do think that provides a sort of petri dish for these more superficial concepts of identity, where even as progressives rightfully talk about how race is mostly a fiction and mostly constructed, they also say the most important thing about someone is their race or their status as a member of a marginalized group. And I think if I think if we had a richer, healthier civic life, maybe there'd be less of an appetite for that.
Andy, how do you view these trends as I think someone who's been kind of looking at the left rather than being part of it? In terms of watching what you think the political left's priorities are, obviously you've been covering the far left a lot in terms of people out in the streets, but you spoke earlier about the Democratic Party. In terms of how you've seen the left shift in priorities, as far as you've been watching politics and following politics, how would you describe that shift? Where do you think it's coming from, and what do you think it consists of in terms of where the left was in terms of its priorities and where it is now?
I haven't done enough research into this area to have an informed opinion, so I'm kind of just speculating blindly a little bit about the origins of this. Some theories that are out there is that they blame it on ideologies stemming from certain disciplines in the university. That sounds plausible. I'm looking as an outsider. I wonder when it's hard for me to pinpoint what caused this country to be so focused on identity now. It's fascinating for me. I felt like, we have some data to suggest that this country was moving away from that, and then now things have changed. I've seen some commentators blame the presidency of Obama for that, because his identity and was something he cared about a lot, and something that he talked about a lot.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's so strange because from the left perspective, I feel like there's just a completely different read on the Obama presidency, because I've heard what you're saying.
I was going to say the same thing.
It's like he did everything he could to avoid ever talking about race. He did it through the campaign. He did it. There were these touch point moments with the Henry Gates thing and Trayvon Martin when he was forced to address, and you could see the almost physical discomfort in his having to talk about this because it was a third rail for him. So that's kind of how I think a lot of people from the left see it, but I've heard what you're saying from people on the right who think that he was embracing identity at every opportunity. And it's just, I guess it kind of speaks to just the complete disconnect between these two political camps to be able to interpret these events.
Well, I don't think he embraced identity at every opportunity. In fact, he was quite a good unifier on many occasions. But he did provide a lot of field to the Black Lives Matter narrative. And I think that's been one of the most divisive movements and ideologies in recent years to affect this country.
Going into sort of the closing part of the podcast, I think Jesse got involved in kind of a meta debate or a meta argument about the value of debate itself. And Jesse, I want you to talk a little bit about that, and I also want you to talk a little bit about why you thought it was important to come on here and talk to Andy about your disagreements about multiculturalism and Islam and liberalism.
Debate me, bro. I basically tweeted, there's a line a lot of people on the left say, which I will not debate my humanity. I will not debate my right to exist. Now, in 2019, very few political debates are about someone's actual right to exist. That's not to say they aren't important or that doesn't occasionally happen. I use the example of escaped slaves who would literally, in my view, debate and engage with people about their humanity and say, look at me, I'm a human. I'll try to make this short and not boring, but the most famous example is Frederick Douglass, who, of course, did brilliant writing and speaking in the subject. He's like a great, great early American hero. Not that early, but you know what I mean? Great American hero. And if you actually look at his writing somewhat closely, I think he had complicated views on the subject. There's one speech he gave in Rochester where he said it's ridiculous you even have to debate people about slavery. You even have to argue that it's bad because it's so on its face bad. Now, that speech was given to a very specific audience of white moderates he was trying to fire up. Elsewhere in Boston, he once gave a speech saying that free speech alone could end slavery in 5 years, which is almost certainly something you shouldn't take literally. So I think he had complicated views on the subject, but I'm frustrated by this fear of any sort of debate or engagement with conservatives. And I do think a lot of the people saying things like, I will not debate my right to exist, are coming from a fairly privileged perspective. Like the Times just ran a column by I don't know if it was by or about, I didn't actually click through, but there's a Palestinian kid who got shot by Israeli forces. And what he said is, I want to sit down and talk to the soldier who shot me and ask him why he did what he did. And could you come up with a better example of actually having to defend your humanity? And I think people caricature this point as though I'm saying debate solves everything or debate is always a panacea. But there were parts of the world where slavery was ended without civil war. And in the U.S., the North was outlawed slavery in part because people grew disgusted with slavery.
Right, and a number of the southern states also only narrowly voted to secede. I mean, they had very vigorous debates. Maybe if the debates were a little bit better, who knows? Right.
So it's obviously easy to get accidentally venture into cartoonish debate me bro territory. I don't think any individual should be compelled to debate anyone else. And I think people are often over extrapolating from like a Nazi showing up in their mention. But the reason I came on this podcast and the reason I'm going to keep hammering home this point is because I think the left is in an extremely weak position in the U.S. And I think there's institutional barriers. There's the electoral college. There's the fact that, a lot of our country is run by the far right at the moment at every level. And this idea that anyone left of center can have the luxury to pick and choose who will engage with or to not try to convince some people, or that every Trump voter is racist and can't be swayed. I don't think there's any evidence for any of that. And I really do think it's mostly privileged people sitting in situations where they just, they don't feel like engaging with the people they find disgusting.
I also think the left needs to decide, or a certain faction of the left needs to decide whether words are literal violence, or debate has never amounted to anything in the real world, because those two things cannot both be true at the same time.
Well, that's what I find so shocking about it, is it's simultaneously debate never swayed anybody, but if Richard Spencer's allowed to talk, it will normalize bigotry and turn people into white supremacists. Not only that, but if the New York Times words a headline in the wrong way, or doesn't shit on the Nazi enough that it's profiling, that normalizes white supremacy. It's a completely incoherent worldview, and it's basically just geared around a desire to sort of shout people down and never talk about anything.
And Andy, you are an editor at Quillette, which I've written for Quillette a couple of times, and I would say one of the most impressive things about them is that they are very vigorous with their edits, and they are obsessed with persuading people. They don't want to come across as unpersuasive in any way. They hate just talking to a limited base of people. So I assume you have the same ethos, that you really do believe in the value of having these debates.
I do, and at the same time, I've been dealing with some questions personally for myself. Like, for example, how do you balance, how does a state balance the protection of free speech for its citizens when trying to deal with extremist ideologies and preachers or ideologues who actually are shown to radicalize and make people push in the direction of either jihad or violent white racism. And when you start weighing in those other variables, it becomes a little bit harder than to just constantly say, I'm a free speech absolutist. So these are questions that I'm wrestling with internally. In terms of being with Quillette, I'm very lucky to work with a publication that frequently that I'm very lucky to be with a publication that publishes the viewpoints that it does, this diversity of sides, and it often angers people who some assumes were staunch allies of the publication, but they've been upset by certain things that have been published. I think that shows a healthy publication. And if I may, as we're closing up, there was a point I wanted to address earlier that kind of wraps together many of the things we talked about, like mass migration, multiculturalism, identity, and gay identity. I keep pointing to Britain as a really good example of what happens when the state institutionalizes multiculturalism and also enacts policies of bringing in very large numbers of people from disparate cultures very quickly. One of the losers of that has actually been gays. People don't really think about that. If you look at a 2009 Gallup poll in the UK, they found that 0% of British Muslims believed homosexuality was morally acceptable. ICM repeated a similar poll in 2016. They found that 52% believed homosexuality should be illegal in the country. In London, which is held up as this cosmopolitan dream of such a multicultural society of every culture living side by side, well, London actually has one of the highest levels of intolerance of homosexuality, and that was done by a survey in 2018 by Nuance, and they attribute that to religious differences. So,
it's been really great to have you both on here. I don't always agree with either one of you on everything, but I definitely follow your work. And Jesse, if people want to read you and they want to follow you, where's the best way to do that?
I usually write for New York Magazine, but you can also check out my newsletter, jessesingal.substack.com. And I'm right on Twitter, Jesse Singal. I'm on Twitter too much, so you'll see me there.
Great. And Andy, obviously you're editing at Quillette, but where else are you writing if people want to see you?
I am also on Twitter too much. My Twitter handle is Mr. Andy Ngo. Unfortunately, I don't have a cool newsletter like Jesse, but maybe that's something I should do.
Thanks for listening to Extremely Offline. Extremely Offline is produced by Zaid, Jilani, and me, Leighton Woodhouse. Music is by Breakmaster Cylinder. Please help us keep this show going by visiting patreon.com/extremely-offline and chipping in just a few dollars a month. We'll be back with a new episode soon.